I never thought I'd be the kind of man who writes about his own heartbreak. My name is Nathan Adler, and for most of my adult life, I kept my feelings folded neatly, like pressed shirts in a closet, presentable, controlled, never on display. That is the kind of man I was raised to be. My father didn't cry at funerals. My grandfather didn't flinch when he lost 2 fingers at the timber yard. Emotion, in our family, was a luxury other people afforded. So when my marriage of 6 years began to crack, I did what I had always done. I kept quiet, kept showing up, kept believing that love, real love, was enough to hold things together. Her name was Priya. I met her at a mutual friend's housewarming party in 2015. She was laughing at something near the kitchen, her head thrown back, completely uninhibited. I had never seen someone laugh like that in public, so freely, so unself-consciously. I remember thinking, whoever she has decided to be happy. I wanted to understand how someone arrived at that decision. I wanted to be close to it. By the end of that evening, I had her number and a reason to check my phone every 10 minutes for the next 3 days. We married in 2017. It was a small wedding, 40 people in her parents' garden, fairy lights strung between mango trees, the smell of jasmine overwhelming everything. I stood at the end of a makeshift aisle and watched her walk toward me and thought, I have done something right to deserve this moment. That is the most honest thing I can tell you about who I was back then. A man who measured his worth by what life brought him, rather than what he brought to life. The early years were good. Not perfect, no marriage is, but genuinely good in the way that shared coffee and evening walks and inside jokes are good. We bought a small apartment. I was working as a civil engineer for a mid-sized infrastructure firm, long hours but steady pay. Priya was a graphic designer, freelancing mostly, building a small but loyal client base. We didn't have much, but we had rhythm. We had a routine that felt like ours, and for a long time, that felt like enough. The first signs appeared in year 4. Looking back now, I see them clearly. Hindsight has a brutality that foresight never does. She started spending more time on her phone, tilting the screen away slightly when I came near. She started going to bed later, saying she was on a deadline. She stopped asking about my day with that particular quality of curiosity she used to have, the kind where she actually listened and then asked a follow-up question that showed she had absorbed what I said. Conversations became transactional. Did you pay the electricity bill? Can you pick up milk? I'll be late on Thursday. I noticed. I always noticed. But I told myself it was the pressure of her trying to grow her business. I told myself marriage went through seasons, and this was just winter. Cold, grey, but temporary. I told myself I was probably working too much and not being present enough. I turned the lens on myself, the way well-meaning partners do, and missed what was happening right in front of me. His name, I would later learn, was Vikram. He was a creative director at a mid-level advertising agency, the kind of man who wore tailored shirts to brunch and talked loudly about emerging markets and personal branding. He was Priya's new client, then her collaborator, then, somewhere in the months I was not paying close enough attention, something else entirely. He was 38 to my 34. He drove a car that cost more than my annual salary. He took Priya to industry events and gallery openings and rooftop dinners where people networked and photographed their food and spoke about disruption as though it were a virtue. I found out on a Tuesday evening in February. Not from her. She didn't tell me. I found out the way most betrayed spouses do, by accident. Her laptop was open on the kitchen counter. A message notification appeared. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious in that acute, searching way. I just happened to be standing close enough to read 6 words before I could stop myself. 6 words that rearranged everything. I keep thinking about last night. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that. The rice was boiling on the stove. The exhaust fan was humming. Outside, someone was playing music in the building across the street. Everything was ordinary, and nothing would ever be ordinary again. That is the specific cruelty of moments like that. The world doesn't pause to acknowledge them. You receive the worst news of your life, and the rice still boils over. When Priya came home that night, I didn't say anything. I'm not sure I could have articulated why. Partly shock, partly a strange, suspended need to understand more before I spoke. Partly, and this is the part one I'm least proud of, a terrified hope that I had misread it, that there was an innocent explanation, that 6 words could mean something other than what they obviously meant. There was no innocent explanation. Over the following days, I learned more than I wanted to know. The relationship had been ongoing for nearly 4 months. It was not a single lapse in judgment. It was sustained, deliberate, and apparently significant enough that Priya had, somewhere in her private calculations, begun comparing her 2 lives and finding mine wanting. I confronted her on a Friday night. I had waited until the weekend because I knew, somehow I knew, that whatever happened next would require more than a single evening to survive. The conversation was not what I had expected. There was no tearful confession, no falling to her knees with remorse. What I got instead was something more disorienting, a kind of careful, measured honesty that felt rehearsed. She said she had feelings for Vikram that she hadn't been able to ignore. She said she felt their connection was on a different level, intellectually, creatively, in every way that apparently mattered to her now. She said she had stayed in our marriage longer than she should have because she was afraid of hurting me. Afraid of hurting me. She had conducted a 4-month affair, and the consideration she offered me was that she had stayed a few extra weeks to cushion the blow. She said she wanted a separation. She said she was sorry, but the apology had the weight of something said because it was expected, not because it was felt. She moved out within 2 weeks. She didn't go directly to Vikram's place. There was an interim period at her sister's apartment, but within 6 weeks she had moved into his flat across the city. I know this because a mutual friend told me with the specific discomfort of someone who didn't want to deliver the information and yet couldn't quite help themselves. I would like to tell you that I handled the immediate aftermath with grace and composure. I didn't entirely. There were nights that were genuinely bad. The particular silence of an apartment that used to hold 2 people. The way you reach for someone in the dark before you remember. The irrational impulse to call her, just to hear a familiar voice before you catch yourself and feel ashamed of the impulse. I ate badly. I slept badly. I threw myself into work with the focused desperation of a man who needs 12 hours of tasks so he doesn't have 6 hours of thinking. But I did not call her. I did not beg. I did not send long messages at midnight explaining my feelings or cataloguing her cruelty or asking questions I already knew the answers to. Some of this was pride. Most of it, though, was something quieter and harder to name. A deep, instinctive understanding that there was nothing to negotiate. She had made a decision. She had chosen. The only dignified response to being someone's option is to remove yourself from the equation entirely and let them live with the choice they made. So I let her go. Cleanly, completely, without theatre. The months that followed were among the most transformative of my life, though they didn't feel that way while I was living through them. Transformation rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons, as slightly longer runs than usual, as the slow accumulation of evenings you survived alone and found you were still standing at the end of. My closest friend, Rohan, was invaluable during this period. He had known Priya and liked her, but he had the wisdom to set that aside and simply be present. He came over on the weekends. He ate bad takeaway with me and watched cricket and didn't push me to talk about my feelings when I didn't want to, and listened carefully when I did. I think what people in grief often need most is not advice but witness. Someone who simply agrees to be in the room with you while you go through it. Rohan was that. I started seeing a therapist around month 3. I had resisted this for a while, partly because of the way I was raised, the folded shirt mentality, and partly because I told myself I was managing. My therapist, a quiet and precise man named Dr. Kapoor, helped me understand something I had been circling without being able to articulate. I had built my self-worth on a foundation of being chosen. As long as Priya chose me, I was valuable. When she stopped choosing me, I had nothing underneath to stand on. That was the real work. Not processing the betrayal, though that mattered too, but rebuilding a sense of my own value that was not contingent on someone else's approval. learning to be the person who chooses himself rather than the person who waits to be chosen. I started doing things for myself with a deliberateness I had never applied to my own life before. I signed up for a woodworking class on Saturday mornings, something I'd wanted to do for years and kept deferring. I started running seriously, not as punishment or escape, but because I liked the way it made me feel competent in my own body. I called my parents more. I read the books that had been stacking up on my nightstand for years. I had dinners with old friends I had let drift. I took a solo trip to Cork for 5 days in July, hiked in the rain, and sat on a balcony each evening with a cup of tea, watching the mist move through the estate, and felt, for the first time in months, something that was not quite happiness, but was adjacent to it, something like spaciousness. I started to understand that life I had been living before was not quite my life. It was a shared life, which is beautiful and worthwhile, but I had dissolved into it so entirely that I had stopped being a distinct person inside it. I had become Nathan and Priya rather than Nathan, and when Priya left, I didn't know who Nathan was. The months alone were, in the most painful and necessary way, an introduction to myself. Word reached me about Vikram in pieces, the way it usually does in a world of mutual connections and social media and well-meaning people who can't quite keep information to themselves. Apparently, the relationship that had been worth destroying a marriage for was not quite the elevated partnership Priya had imagined. Vikram was, by multiple accounts, a man who was very good at the beginning of things and considerably less reliable at the middle and end of them. He had a pattern, not with Priya specifically, but in general, of intense, intoxicating courtship followed by slow withdrawal. He was the kind of man who was brilliant at making you feel like the most interesting person in the room right up until the moment someone more interesting walked in. Priya had been, for him, a chapter. She had mistaken herself for the whole book. It was around the 8-month mark that she reached out. A message, initially, carefully worded, the kind of message that has been drafted and deleted and redrafted many times. She said she missed talking to me. She asked if I was well. She said she had been doing a lot of thinking. I read it twice and put my phone face down on the table and went for a run. I didn't respond that day. Not out of cruelty. I want to be clear about that. But because I needed to know what I actually felt before I said anything. That had become a new practice for me, checking in with myself before reacting. Nathan, who had learned finally to consult himself. She called 2 weeks later, I answered. She asked if we could meet for coffee. Her voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it before, a certain exhaustion, a flatness, like a note that had been played too many times and had lost its resonance. I said yes. We met at a cafe near our old apartment, neutral ground, familiar enough not to feel hostile. She looked different. Thinner. A little older around the eyes, in a way that had nothing to do with time and everything to do with something she had been through. She sat down across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. And in that silence, I noticed something remarkable. I felt calm. Not the brittle, effortful calm of suppression, but genuine steadiness. I was okay. I had become, in 8 months, genuinely okay, and I hadn't fully realized it until that moment. She told me what had happened. Not in great detail. She wasn't someone who narrated her own failures at length, but enough. Vikram had ended things around month 6. Not dramatically. He had simply become less available and then absent, the way a tide goes out, and eventually she had understood that he was not coming back. She had been staying with her sister again. She was rebuilding her client base, which had suffered during the upheaval. She was tired. She said she had made a mistake. She said she had been chasing something she didn't understand and had lost something real in the process. She looked at me then, with a quality of hoping in her eyes that I recognized from years of knowing her face. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. There was grief, not for her exactly, but for the version of us that had existed before any of this, for the garden wedding and the fairy lights and the man I was when I believed I had done something right to deserve that moment. That version of the story is worth grieving. I don't apologize for the grief. But there was also clarity, the most complete clarity I have ever felt. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list her cruelties. I didn't perform the anger she may have expected or offer the forgiveness she may have hoped for. I took a slow breath, and I told her the truth. I told her that I was grateful for what we had built together, and genuinely sorry for the ways I had failed to be fully present in our marriage, because I had failed in my own ways, and owning that mattered to me. I told her that the months apart had been the hardest and most important of my life, that I had used them to understand myself in ways I should have understood myself much earlier. And then I told her something that seemed to surprise her completely. I thanked her. I thanked her for leaving. Not sarcastically. I want to be precise about this, because it would be easy to read cruelty into it, and there was none intended. I thanked her sincerely, because her leaving had forced me to meet myself. It had stripped away the comfortable scaffolding of a shared life, and left me standing in a space where I had no choice but to figure out who I was and what I was actually worth. I had needed that. I hadn't known I needed it. I would not have chosen it. But I needed it, and it had arrived in the form of the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and I was, genuinely, with full clarity, grateful. I told her I had made a decision. Not from fear, not from loneliness, not from the panicked desire to have things return to how they were. From a calm and settled place in myself that I had spent 8 months building. The decision was that we were done. That what she had done, not the affair alone, but the way she had talked about it, the comparative weighing of me against another man and finding me insufficient, had told me something about who she was that I could not unknow. I wished her well. I meant it. But I was not available for what she was hoping I might be available for. She sat very still for a long moment. She had expected, I think, either anger or forgiveness, both of which would have confirmed that I still needed something from her, that she still had the power to move me significantly in one direction or another. What she got instead was something she didn't have a script for, a man who was fine, a man who had resolved, a man who had, without theatrics or revenge, simply moved past her. That, I think, was the thing that shocked her. Not what I said, but the absence of need underneath it, the unshakable quality of it, the fact that there was nothing she could offer that would alter the outcome, because the outcome had been arrived at from a place of wholeness rather than hurt. We finished our coffee. We talked for a little while about ordinary things, her sister's new job, a building project I was working on. The conversation was, oddly, not unkind. When she left, she hugged me briefly. She felt different in my arms than she once had. Not smaller exactly, but less significant to my nervous system. Like a song you used to love that now just sounds like a song. I walked home through the evening. The streets were loud with the end-of-day rush, and I moved through it, feeling something I can only describe as solid, rooted, like a man who knew where he stood. I think about that afternoon often, not with nostalgia and not with anger, but with a sort of quiet respect for the full arc of it. Something had to break for me to be rebuilt. The thing that broke me was real and painful, and I don't minimize it. But what came out the other side was something I wouldn't trade. There is a version of this story where I am the wronged hero, righteous and vindicated. I don't think that story serves anyone well, including me. The truth is more complicated. I was a man who loved someone and wasn't fully present in that love. She was a woman who made choices she didn't fully understand and paid a price she hadn't fully calculated. We both found things on the other side of that ending that we wouldn't have found inside it. What I want to tell anyone who is standing where I was standing, in a kitchen with rice boiling over, reading 6 words that change everything, is this: do not beg. Not because dignity is more important than love. It isn't always. But because the person who would require you to beg is already telling you clearly what they think you are worth. And you will only fully understand your own worth when you decide, quietly and without performance, to believe something different. Let them go. Use the space. Introduce yourself to yourself.